Bonjour mesdames et messieurs, je suis très heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui. Today I'm going to speak about applying an evidence-based policy to evaluate social interventions. We've already discussed this morning evidence-based policy has strong origins in evidence-based medicine. We have, of course, discussed the large role that the Cochrane organisation has played in this. It's a picture of Archie Cochrane, who the organisation was named after. And we have also briefly discussed how systematic reviews of randomised controlled trials are increasingly being seen as sitting very near the top of the hierarchy of evidence. They're considered the most objective, the most unbiased, and the most reliable. So this has had a major impact on the medical evidence base. So considering that, the logical next step was then to start to research social interventions in a similar, more systematic way. There's a wide range of systematic reviews of randomised controlled trials of social interventions already available. There's the Campbell collaboration has numerous very excellent systematic reviews. The Cochrane does focus more on health-based interventions, but there is one group, the Developmental, Psychosocial and Learning Problems group, that does research and publish a large number of social intervention reviews. And this is the group that I'm primarily working with. So I took the name of the intervention being reviewed by every single review in the developmental group of Cochrane. So you can see the most commonly reviewed intervention is cognitive behavioural training, and these are followed closely by things like social skills groups training, parent training, psychological, music-based. So you can see there's a wide range of different types of social interventions all being reviewed by this group. So what I'm going to do is discuss with you some of the challenges that a review of social interventions are likely to come across, and how each of these challenges can sometimes be seen as an opportunity. I'm going to discuss this by drawing on some of my own personal experience and using the example of a review that I was recently involved in that looked at the effectiveness, acceptability and cost effectiveness of psychosocial interventions for maltreated children and adolescents. This review was led by Professor Geraldine MacDonald at Queen's University. It was funded by National Institute for Health Research, and it's going to be published very soon in their Health Technology Assessment Journal. But in the course of this review, we did try to stick as closely as possible to the method that Cochrane would expect. So these are just some of the typical challenges that anyone who's doing a systematic review is probably going to face, but anyone doing a systematic review of social interventions, there are some particular issues that they may come across and that we certainly came across. So to begin with designing the PICO. Those of you who have run a systematic review before will know this, but for those who don't, just to explain a little bit, the PICO is the specific criteria that you set out at the start of your review that defines exactly what you're interested in. So you define exactly what type of participants you're interested in, what type of interventions you're interested in, what type of comparison you want to make, and sometimes even what outcomes you're interested in. So for a medical-based systematic review, sometimes, not always, but sometimes this is quite a straightforward process. You're just saying that the participant is people with diabetes, the intervention you're interested in is insulin, and comparison is placebo. Very straightforward. But it's a lot more difficult to try and define a non-medical condition and a social intervention. There's several ways that you could define a person who has been maltreated, and there's several different types of social interventions that can be used for this, for someone who has received maltreatment, and there's just an unending list of ways you could describe this. And the problem was many of the complexities and many of the variations in definitions we didn't actually come across until we had begun the review and begun to sift through the search results. So as a result, the PICO that we set out at the start, it became a constantly evolving creature. We constantly had to, every time we came across one of these complexities, we had to stop what we were doing, go back to the original PICO. Many times we had to make additions or add addendums to clarify all these uncertainties that we were coming across. So I won't go through all of these, but just for example, our original PICO, we said that we were interested in children who had been maltreated. But then as we started the process, we came across many studies that involved types of maltreatment we hadn't considered. For example, maltreatment during a conflict or a war situation. We realised that there's going to be psychological issues associated with that sort of maltreatment that could confound our overall results. So we realised that we had to go back to our PICO and clarify that not every type of maltreatment was eligible. We wanted to exclude a few types. Another issue was we originally said we were interested in any psychosocial intervention that was provided for maltreated children. But again, during the course of the review, we came across many excellent studies that provided interventions for the parents of these children with the aim of helping the children in the long term. And we realised that these interventions were also eligible because they had the exact same purpose and fitted the research question that we were trying to address. So this was a very frustrating process, but at the same time, I think it was a fantastic opportunity because it meant that we did this PICO involved so much thorough thought and care and attention to detail. And the main thing about a systematic review of a randomised controlled trial is that a lot of the time there's no right way or wrong way to do something, but you have to justify what you're doing. And we can certainly justify every decision we made because every decision involves so much thought and had to be written up so many times. And also now that we have the much more elaborate and detailed PICO, the process of updating the review in the future will become an awful lot more straightforward. And we can also use this PICO next time we go to do a similar type of review, also looking at a wide type of participant or intervention type. The next issue we came across that many systematic reviewers of social interventions are likely to come across is difficulties in conducting the search. Again, some of you will know that when you're designing a search strategy for a review, the typical way you do this is you think of every single way you can describe the population you're interested in, so every term, every word that describes your population, every word that describes your intervention, and every word that describes the type of study that you're interested in. And then any studies that the search finds are studies that fit all three of these categories. The problem we faced was that there's an extensively long list of synonyms describing a maltreated population and the type of social intervention that we were interested in. The list seemed to never end. And on top of that, we weren't just asking one question in this review, we were asking three different questions. We wanted to know about the effectiveness of these interventions. So the type of study there would be usually randomised trials, certainly quantitative studies. We also wanted to know about the acceptability of these interventions, so those would be more qualitative studies. And also we were interested in synthesising data about the cost effectiveness of these interventions, so those would be health economic studies. So our original plan had been design three different search strategies to answer each of these three questions and run the three simultaneously. But then when we saw how long the list of synonyms was going to be for describing population and intervention, we realised this was a very unrealistic task. There was just no way we would have the time or resources. So what we did instead was we just did one overarching search and sift strategy. So rather than searching for a study at all, we just searched for all the types of population and all the types of intervention we were interested in. And then it was, there were only three of us who were working on the sifting process, and we sifted simultaneously. And for every article we read, we asked ourselves three times. We asked ourselves, is it relevant to the effectiveness synthesis? No. Is it relevant to the acceptability synthesis? No. Is it relevant to the health economic synthesis? Yes. So one of the best things about this was that it was a very consistent process because it was the same person making the same decision across the three different types of questions. And also, again, this one overarching search strategy is going to make updating the search in future editions of the review much more straightforward. The next issue that we came across was choosing the studies to go into the review. So medical interventions, we've touched on this already, that RCTs are often considered the gold standard. I agree with Paul, I don't really like that term, but I think it's bandied about quite a lot. But with social interventions, there are certainly many RCTs, but a lot of the time they're considered a little more impractical, sometimes unethical, and many people consider them to be less informative than non-randomised trials. Our search, it was a massive search, and we ended up identifying nearly 40,000 potentially relevant records that myself and my two colleagues had to sift through every single one of those. And as a result, we included 196 studies in the effectiveness portion of the syntheses. On top of that, there were also 73 studies in the acceptability synthesis and 6 studies in the cost-effectiveness synthesis. But I'm just going to focus on the effectiveness synthesis for the rest of this talk. Of these 196 studies, randomised trials were a minority. There were only 31% of them were randomised trials. All of the rest were either non-randomised trials or, in many cases, they were uncontrolled trials. But this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It allowed us to explore findings from a wider range of designs. Randomised trials are wonderful for giving you precise estimates of the effectiveness, but the other trials provided much more contextual information, so we did get a slightly better idea about exactly what aspects of these interventions may or may not be effective. And aside from that, I actually think it's a very important thing to highlight that there are so few randomised controlled trials in social interventions, because they're feasible and they're certainly very worthwhile, but I think that people immediately shy away from doing them because they assume they can't be done when, of course, they can. The next decision that we came across that a lot of reviewers might face is trying to identify data to pool in a meta-analysis. So when selecting data to put into a meta-analysis, it's important to minimise heterogeneity. So you want to ensure that any study you put into a meta-analysis is as similar as possible clinically, so it's the same types of participants and interventions, and methodologically, of course. So we made a decision right from the start that we would only put data from randomised trials into the meta-analysis. So that left us with 60 trials to search for data to pool. Within that, of the 196 studies, there were 22 different types of interventions that we found in the end. And of those 22 types of interventions, we could only do meta-analyses for 5 because none of the other interventions either had enough data or had a second study to compare with. One of those 5 was cognitive behavioural interventions, and that's where the majority of the data was going. There was a massive amount of data that we could pull to look at the effectiveness of cognitive behavioural interventions, but very little data to look at many of the other interventions. So these are the 5 interventions that we were able to do meta-analyses for. So you can see there were 23 studies for CBT, so there were a total of 14 different meta-analyses we could run there. And then attachment-based interventions, parent-child interaction therapy, family therapy, and psychoeducation. However, there were 5 other types of interventions that we couldn't do meta-analyses for, because even though, for example, in enhanced foster care, there were 3 different studies looking at enhanced foster care, but there were no common outcomes across those 3 studies, so there was nothing to combine. 6 types of interventions here, we only found 1 randomised control trial for each of them, so we couldn't pool anything here because there was no second randomised trial to pool it with. And then finally, these 6 interventions, there were no randomised trials. Every paper written about these was either a non-randomised trial or an uncontrolled trial. So this was a really interesting process because it allowed us the perspective to recognise that CBT, it might not be the best, it's just been the most frequently researched. I know we ran a few advisory groups with clinicians and with young people, and CBT was constantly discussed and mentioned because it's a very popular technique. There's a bit of an assumption that it's the best technique because it's the most well known. But doing this review made us realise that it might not be that it's the best. It might just be that there's so much evidence about it, people assume it's the best. Whereas some of the other interventions, like enhanced foster care, it could be just as good, it could be even better, but we don't know because the evidence isn't there to tell us that. Another issue with social interventions is assessing the risk of bias. Again, this was briefly mentioned before, assessing the risk of bias is a way of assessing the validity of a randomised trial. So you're looking at things like, was the method of randomisation adequate? Were participants and outcome assessors blinded? Did study authors publish all of the outcomes they intended to publish? And there's quite a few issues here when it comes to social interventions. As we've seen by the small number of randomised trials found in our review, a lot of social interventions don't even try to make use of random allocation. They just assume it's unfeasible, or they just assume other types of trials might just be more appropriate. But on top of that, social interventions, many assume that blinding isn't feasible. If you're receiving a talking intervention, so you're obviously going to know that you're receiving the intervention rather than receiving no intervention. And a problem that we came across, and that I'm sure many people will come across in similar reviews, is that a lot of social intervention trials don't actually have protocols. So it was very difficult to judge issues like selective outcome reporting. But these were all really interesting findings, because it gave us a chance to start some important debates in this area. For example, is a low-quality randomised trial really going to be better than a high-quality non-randomised trial? Why are we so determined to focus only on the evidence from randomised trials if it's a low-quality randomised trial? I don't think that blinding is always unfeasible in social interventions. I understand that in some situations it'll be very difficult to blind the participants, but I think that in nearly all situations, outcome assessors and administrators should and could always be blinded. And also, it was an interesting process requesting information from the authors. As the process went on, we were developing more and more ways to ask more open-ended questions, so we could avoid getting just overly positive answers from authors. So, for example, if you email an author and say, "Did you report all of the outcomes you intended to?" they're naturally going to reply and say, "Yes, I did." But if you go back and say, "Could I see maybe an unpublished protocol or just your original plan?" It's a better way to just gently find out, did they really do what you expected them to? And then a final issue with social interventions is establishing evidence of effectiveness. So again, not always, but very often, health-based interventions have quite dichotomous outcomes. The condition was either cured or not cured. Whereas social interventions usually involve slightly more complex psychosocial outcomes, which means that it's harder to give a definitive effective versus not effective answer. So for a health-based intervention, you might be able to say this drug stopped the bleeding, so it definitely worked. Whereas with a social intervention, it's very difficult to say this intervention stopped the child feeling negatively about maltreatment. That's something that's never going to happen. So it's a more complex process and complex outcome. But personally, I consider the fact that a lot of social intervention reviews cannot give a definitive answer is a strength, not a weakness. Because I think that presenting complex outcomes like these, it makes it clear that all a review has done, and all any review can really do, is provide an overview of the current evidence base and provide a probability that a person may respond to treatment. I know a lot of people, it's very easy to misinterpret a systematic review, and people do jump to conclusions about this proves it definitely works, this proves it definitely doesn't work. So with presenting more complex outcomes like this, I think it's just that bit, you're less likely to mislead people with a type 1 or type 2 error. So in conclusion, evidence-based policy, it is a very, very challenging process to use this to assess the effectiveness of a social intervention. There's numerous complexities, many of which you're not even aware of until you're halfway through the process. But I have been involved in many systematic reviews of social interventions over the years, and they're always challenging, but they're always feasible. I've always got through the other end, and we've always produced a piece of work that we're all very proud of and can stand by. So I do think that while it's a difficult process, it's certainly a very worthwhile process, and one that we should certainly be advocating. Merci beaucoup de votre attention.
So we have plenty of time for questions. Sébastien?
Sébastien Cordel. Could you tell us what is meant by PICO? What is sifting and how do you do the sifting? And the third one is CBT. What is CBT?
Okay. Sorry, yes. If you're doing a systematic review of a randomised controlled trial, the first thing you have to do is decide how you're going to decide what studies you find go into your review and what studies do not go into your review. So you design what's called a PICO, and it's PICO. So the P stands for participants, intervention, comparison, and outcome. So you have to define very clearly what type of participant you're interested in, what type of intervention you're interested in, what type of comparison, and what outcome. So for us, the participants we were interested in were people who had been maltreated before the age of 18. The intervention, we were just looking for any type of psychosocial intervention. Really, any non-medical intervention is what we ended up looking for, anything that wasn't a drug. The comparison, we were looking for studies that compared the intervention either to an alternative treatment or to no treatment. And the outcome, we were looking for psychosocial outcomes like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, cognitive functioning, quality of life, stability in whatever new living situation they may be in. So that's PICO. Sifting. After you've designed your PICO, you run the search, you search through as many databases as you can, you end up with a large number of studies that you have to then decide which studies go into your review and which do not, and that process is called sifting. So you're literally sifting through the studies. You read each study in turn, and you decide, does this fit the PICO that I just designed? And if it does, then it goes into your review. If it doesn't, you leave it out of your review. And then finally, CBT. Okay, CBT is cognitive behavioural therapy. So it's a psychosocial intervention that really it teaches people a new way of thinking. So, for example, it helps people recognise how certain thought processes lead to certain behaviours. So, for example, if someone was quite nervous to get on a plane, they start to think about all the worst things that could happen. They imagine the plane is going to crash. Or something will go wrong, and then that makes them not want to get on the plane. Whereas cognitive behavioural therapy would help them recognise that the thoughts they're having are unrealistic and that they're holding them back, and it would help them to help them to manage those thoughts so that then they could manage their behaviour and get on the plane. Does that make sense? Okay.
I had just, while the microphone is coming, he will take the microphone. But what you describe in the complexity and how the complexity comes back and changes, this is exactly what we do when we do research, real research, not technological research, which is just like engineering. And this is what is very difficult to understand by the agencies today. And so I understand that when it is research is science, real science, is already difficult to make them understand. Yes. So I understand how it is difficult for you.
Thank you for your talk. My question is, what do you think about social interventions that where the purpose is public health or medical? I think about a typical kind as obesity is very linked with social conditions. Are they excluded for your field? Do you know why? Why do you separate social interventions and medical purpose or public health purpose?
No, I agree. They shouldn't be separated. I actually think that the best type of intervention is a multidisciplinary intervention, because I don't think I think exactly as you describe, many conditions. There's no one cause, so there's no one solution. There's many causes. There are maybe biological causes, but there are also psychological causes, social causes, which is why an intervention that tries to combine all of the relevant causes is hopefully going to be the most effective. I completely agree.
Because I know a very big RCT in social intervention about obesity, and it works, not very much, but giving people some money to change their habitation from a place for another place, and they test how much they decrease their weight, cholesterol, and so on, and it works. I think about that.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.